we've been doing in this class is we've been going through a chapter of Daniel a session, which is hard to do because there's a lot in Daniel. And we're using this as a supplement, which is John Lennox's book on Daniel, which is a great book you ought to avail yourselves of if you don't have it, Against the Flow, the Inspiration of Daniel in an Age of Relativism. And here's the overview of Daniel. This is going to be repetition for those who have been here before, but I think it's always good to get the big picture before you drill down in one section. Daniel, the first 6 chapters deal with Daniel's ministry in Babylon. As you know, at the time they're in exile. They're actually in Babylon. Jerusalem has been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar, so they're all in Babylon. And then chapters 7 through 12 is Israel's part in world events. And let's just go through the first 8 chapters really quickly, kind of the overall picture of each chapter. Chapter 1, you remember Daniel doesn't want to eat, so he goes on the Daniel diet. He doesn't want to defile himself. He wants to remain unstained by the world. And actually, he turns out looking better than everybody else, and he survives. There's no blowback from the king. Daniel chapter 2, of course, is the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, where he dreams about the succession of nations, and Daniel's the only one who can interpret it properly. Daniel chapter 3 is the famous fiery furnace where Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego decide they're not going to bow down to Nebuchadnezzar's image or whatever image he put up. Maybe it may have been the image of Marduk. And they say, not only will we not bow down, our God will save us. And if he doesn't save us, even if he doesn't save us, we're not going to bow down. We're not, even if he doesn't. I mean, there's one level of faith. There's another level of faith which says even if he does not save us, we're not going to bow down Nebuchadnezzar. Chapter 4, of course, deals with Nebuchadnezzar, who gets a little bit too prideful, and God really turns him into a beast for about 7 years. He has this strange disease. He ultimately regains his reason and takes back the throne. So the sovereign God humbles the proud. By the way, what's the overall theme of Daniel? Review? Yeah, God is sovereign, and you see this over and over again through each chapter. Chapter 5 may be the most famous chapter in the book, the handwriting on the wall, where King Belshazzar gets a little bit too arrogant with the utensils from the temple in Babylon. He starts drinking there, and they're worshiping their gods there, and then a hand comes out and says, your reign's going to end tonight, and it does. And then the Medo-Persians take over. Cyrus's army diverts the river, goes under the walls of Babylon and takes it over. That actually is in 539 BC, October 12, 539 BC. Actually, this might be the most famous chapter. Chapter 6, Daniel in the lion's den. He disobeys the edict not to pray to anyone but the king. And so they throw him in the lion's den, and of course he survives there. It's interesting, in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel refuses to eat. In Daniel chapter 6, the lions refuse to eat. So now we get into chapter 7, and chapter 7 deals with a beast, and the beast will be judged by the Son of Man coming in the clouds, which is a reference to Jesus' judgment in the future. Chapter 8 deals with a vision that Daniel had, and it deals with Alexander the Great overtaking the Persians, and ultimately talks about Antiochus Epiphanes, who was the Syrian king, part of the Greek Empire, who decided to defile the temple by sacrificing a pig on the altar of the temple. And that's where it says truth will be thrown to the ground. And last time we went through all that, we talked about Judas Maccabeus and his brothers who fought back against these Hellenistic Greeks, these Greeks who are trying to squash Judaism. And of course, the ultimate celebration of this today is called what? When Judas Maccabeus takes back the temple and reconsecrates it, it's called Hanukkah. Okay, and Hanukkah. Now we're about to get to probably the most famous chapter of prophecy in the Old Testament. Okay, this is the 77s and the coming of the Messiah. Now, when is this happening chronologically? Right here. It's actually happening as soon as Cyrus takes over, 539 BC. Remember, chapters 1 through 6 are all in chronological order. Then chapter 7 goes backward a little bit, and then chapters 7 through 12 are again in chronological order. So we're right here, in 539 BC. And here's what happens. In the first year of Darius, son of Xerxes, a Mede by descent, who was made ruler of the Babylonian kingdom, that word right there, made ruler, seems to indicate it was probably Cyrus who made this guy the ruler over Babylon. And he was probably that general who decided to side with Cyrus rather than stay with the previous king. And so Cyrus rewarded him by making him ruler over Babylon. So that's who we think this guy is. There's some debate over that, but that's who we think this guy is. Over the Babylonian kingdom, in the first year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood from the scriptures, according to the word of the Lord given to Jeremiah the prophet, that the desolation of Jerusalem would last 70 years. Where do you think he's going to learn this? From Jeremiah the prophet. What chapter is Daniel going to in Jeremiah to say that the exile will be only 70 years? Anyone know?
29.
Jeremiah 29. Here's a Rembrandt of Jeremiah lamenting the destruction of Jerusalem. But Jeremiah 29, and there's a famous verse in Jeremiah 29 that almost everybody quotes. What is it? 29:11. What does 29:11 say? Oh, the plans I have for you. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not to harm you. Plans to give you hope and a future. We've all heard this. Maybe some of us have quoted it. It's in Christian cards. It's when people are going through a tough time. They always quote Jeremiah 29:11. Well, this is the chapter Daniel goes to learn that the exile is only going to last 70 years. And how long has Daniel been in exile at this point? Almost 70 years. Remember, 605. Now, this is 539. So what is that? That's 61 and 5. So he's at about 66 years right now. And he's going to Jeremiah to figure out, when is this thing going to be over? When is it going to be over? So let's take a look at Jeremiah 29. And look at the context here as to what it says. This is Jeremiah 29, beginning verse 1. This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to the surviving elders among the exiles and to the priests, the prophets and all the other people Nebuchadnezzar had carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. This is what the Lord says. Now, whenever you try and interpret a biblical passage, you ought to stop. What do I mean by you ought to stop? You ought to do 4 things, I think. This is real basic, but basic what we call hermeneutics, trying to interpret the passage properly. You ought to figure out what the situation is, what type of literature is it, who's the object of the passage, and is this a prescription for all people or a description of an event in history? If you stop and think about this, you will save yourself a lot of erroneous interpretations of Scripture. So, what is the situation that Jeremiah 29 is speaking of? What's the situation? We already talked about it. What is the situation? They're in exile, right? And this is a letter that is supposed to comfort the exiles, that after 70 years, things are going to be a lot better, okay? And what type of literature is it? Well, it's in the Old Testament, and it looks like a straightforward letter. It's not a poem. It's not a parable. It's not apocalyptic literature. It's just kind of a straightforward text of what's going to happen. You might consider it somewhat prophecy because it is telling the future. Who's the object of the passage?
People of Israel.
The people of Israel, the exiles in Babylon. It's not us. It's not the exiles in Egypt, because there were some that went to Egypt. It's the exiles in Babylon. Is this a prescription for us today or a description of what happened back then? It's a description. So let's look at the passage again. All right? This is the text of the letter that the prophet Jeremiah sent from Jerusalem to who? The surviving elders among the exiles and everybody else Nebuchadnezzar took into exile. Okay? Now, here's what the text says. I'm truncating it a little bit, but it says, when 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise to bring you back to this place. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope in a future. I will gather you from all the nations and places where I have banished you, declares the Lord, and bring you back to the place from which I carried you into exile. Who is this to?
The Israelites.
It's to them in Babylon, right? The situation, they're in exile. It's, as I say, prophecy, but just a straight letter. The object is the people in Babylon, and it's not a prescription, it's a description. So I don't want anyone in here to ever quote this verse again for you. It's not for you. It's not to you. It's not a prescription. It's not a promise to you. Never was, never will be. It does tell you something about the character of God, though. And what's the purpose of life? To know God and to make him known. So God is faithful. God will come forth on his promises. And the promises are to this group of people in exile. Now, if you want to persist in quoting Jeremiah 29:11 as pertaining to you, I submit that you quote Jeremiah 44:11 as pertaining to you. Why? Jeremiah 44:11 is what God's going to do for the exiles who went to Egypt. Because God told them, don't go to Egypt. You know what 44:11 says? Therefore, this is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel says, I am determined to bring disaster on you and destroy all Judah. Why don't you quote that one?
Same book.
Same book.
Same 11.
Same 11, right? Do you see how you can really get off base when you just start yanking verses out of context? In fact, a friend of mine, Greg Kokel, he and I work together on some issues. He's an apologist. He says never quote, or actually he says never read a Bible verse. What does he mean by that? Get the context. Figure out what it's about. Don't just read one verse. There's exceptions. You can, like Proverbs, you can just read one verse, right? But most of the time, when you're talking about some historical thing going on, you need the context. You just can't read one verse. You've got to get the overall context. So get the overall context before you go quoting to your friends, oh, the plans I have for you. No. You know what that does? You know what that actually does? It actually causes people to get disappointed with God. Because this was never intended to be a promise for you or for your friends. And when you don't prosper, oops, the Bible lied. No, the Bible didn't lie. You didn't understand it. And by the way, this actually says you're going to prosper when? 70 years later. So you want to quote it to your buddies? Go ahead. Hey, in 70 years, everything's going to come back. You're going to be good. Don't worry about it. I don't think that's going to be too comforting, is it? No. Okay. So just a little excursus there into Jeremiah. I felt like we had to do that because I'm so frustrated when I hear people quote that verse. It's totally out of context. All right, now let's go back to Daniel. Daniel 9, verse 3. So here's Daniel. I turned to the Lord and pleaded with him in prayer and petition and fasting and in sackcloth and ashes. Now think about this. This guy has been in exile for 7 decades, and he's still praying. Things go wrong for us for a week, and we're like, forget God. Right? This guy's been in exile for almost 7 decades, and he's still praying. What does he pray? One of the greatest prayers in the Bible. We're not going to go through every word of it, but we're going to get the gist of it here. Here's what he says. Oh, Lord, the great and awesome God. By the way, stop using that word unless it's before God, okay? Every time I hear people say awesome, awesome. No, it's only one thing. What word are you saving for God? Huh? Well, the only thing that's awesome is God. Steph Curry's not awesome. He's good, but he's not awesome. All right? O Lord, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love with all who love him and obey his commands, we have sinned and done wrong. We have been wicked and have rebelled. We have turned away from your commands and laws. We have not listened to your servants, the prophets who spoke in your name, to our kings, our princes, and our fathers, and to all the people of the land. Lord, you are righteous, but this day we are covered with shame. Stop right there. Every one of us in here could pray this prayer, couldn't we? Especially if this was America. We could pray the same prayer because we are covered in shame. Lord, this day we are covered in shame. The men of Judah and the people of Jerusalem and all Israel, both near and far, in all the countries where you have scattered us because of our unfaithfulness to you, O Lord. We and our kings, our princes, and our fathers are covered with shame because we have sinned against you. The Lord our God is merciful and forgiving, even though we have rebelled against him. We have not obeyed the Lord or kept the laws he gave us through the servants, the prophets. Then he goes on to ask this in verse 17. Now, our God, hear our prayers and petitions of your servant. For your sake, O Lord, look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Remember, the sanctuary is desolate. It's been destroyed 70 years or so ago. Well, in this case, it's about 50 or so years ago. Look with favor on your desolate sanctuary. Give ear, O God, and hear. Open your eyes and see the desolation of the city that bears your name. We do not make requests of you because we are righteous, but because of your great mercy. We got to take that on board, don't we? You don't come to God thinking he owes you anything, because he doesn't. You come to God humbly as a sinner. And that's what Daniel's doing. Here's Daniel saying, covered with shame. Daniel's been faithful for 70 years, and he's still saying, yeah, we're covered with shame. O Lord, listen. O Lord, forgive. O Lord, hear and act. For your sake, O my God, do not delay, because your city and your people bear your name. And at the end of this prayer, suddenly Gabriel interrupts him. Gabriel, the angel. He returns to Daniel. He's already been with Daniel before. Now he comes back to him. This is the same angel that appeared to Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, and Mary, the mother of Jesus. Okay, so he appears 4 times in the scriptures, twice to Daniel, once to Zechariah, once to Mary. And what does he say? Well, this is what he raises Daniel to his feet, because Daniel is praying. It says, while I was speaking and praying, confessing my sin and the sin of my people Israel, and making my request to the Lord, my God, for his holy hill, while I was still in prayer, Gabriel, the man I had seen in the earlier vision, came to me in swift flight about the time of the evening sacrifice. About the time of the evening sacrifice. Evening sacrifice. There's no temple. They're still doing the sacrifice, even though there's no temple. About the time of the evening sacrifice, he instructed me, and here's what he said to me. Daniel, now wait a minute, before we get into it. If this Gabriel guy is appearing to Daniel in prayer, it's Daniel's praying, what do you think he's appearing to Daniel for? What's he going to do?
Answer his prayer. Give him a message.
He's going to answer his prayer. He's going to give him a message. So the message is actually a response to Daniel's prayer. So again, the 4 most talked about verses in prophecy in the Old Testament we're about to get into them. But again, you got to have the context. The context is Daniel's repenting and asking God for help, and now the angel comes and says, okay, here's the answer. See where we are? Here's the answer. Daniel, I have now come to you for insight and understanding. As soon as you began to pray, an answer was given, which I have come to tell you, for you are highly esteemed. Therefore, consider the message and understand the vision. Now, here come the next 4 verses, as I say, are the most talked about verses in the Old Testament when it comes to prophecy, probably the most talked about. And they're a source of great controversy. Here we go. 77s, it might say in your translation weeks, but the proper way to put it is 7s. 77s have been decreed for your people and your holy city. What do you think your people means? The Israelites. And your holy city? Jerusalem. To finish the transgression, they're in sin, transgression's going to end, to make an end of sin, to make an atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Now there are 6 things going on here in this verse. 6 things that are promised. Let's take a look at them. The 77s actually turn out to be 490 years. 7 times 70 is 490, and years makes the most sense here. It's not months, it's not days, it's years. Okay, so 490 years have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression. In fact, the first 3 here, to finish the transgression and make an end of sin and to make atonement for iniquity is that God is going to end what we might call the bad. And the next three, he's going to bring in the good. He's going to get rid of the transgression, make an end of sin, make an atonement for iniquity. How is he going to do that? We're going to get to that in a minute. But he's going to wipe out the bad, and then he's going to bring in the good. What's the good? To bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up the vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Ultimately, when the final judgment is made, there's no more need for prophecy. Those who are trusting in God are going to be with him, and those who are not trusting in God have made their choice. They don't want God, so they won't be with God. They'll be judged. So there's no need for prophecy anymore. And anoint the most holy place, this could refer to a temple. It could also refer to a person. We're not exactly sure. Now, notice that history is going in a direction. We might say history is his story. It's going in a direction. We have paradise lost in Genesis, paradise regained in Revelation. Everything in between is the story of redemption. It's going in a direction. And these 4 verses are talking about the ultimate consummation of history. At least the last verse or so here does. All right. How is God going to bring an end to all this is the question. Now, what you need to know, go ahead, David.
490 years are beginning like right now?
Well, we're getting there. Hang on. We're not quite there yet. We're not quite there yet. Hold on. Hold the call.
When you said sevens.
77s.
Yeah, 77.
Or 70 weeks, your translation might say. Yeah.
Yeah, because that's 490 weeks.
Weeks, but the weeks don't mean, there's precedent in Scripture that the word week means a set of sevens rather than what you might say 7 days. It means a set of sevens. And so scholars have looked at this and said it couldn't be days. It's not months. There's no use for that, previous use for that meaning months or anything else. It means years. So we're talking 490 years. Now, one way we know this is that these 490 years are not arbitrary. In fact, it's not just 490 years looking forward, it's 490 years looking backward. Because from Daniel's day backward, if you go to Leviticus 26, you realize that for 490 years, the Israelites were not obeying the Sabbath. They were not resting the land on the 7th year. They had violated that for 490 years. And so now it's going to take another 490 years for them to atone for that. And these 490 years are a mirror image of the 490 years they were not obeying. Okay, so we'll see where this goes. Just hang on. We're going to see where this goes into the future. But from Daniel's day backwards, you're back to the period that the Israelites for 490 years were not obeying the Lord. All right, so these units of 70. Now, the next verse. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and build Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Okay, hold the phone right there. He's breaking up the 77s into 7 and 62, which is 69. There's another 7 coming later, but hang on. All right? Now, do you see this? This is a picture of Jerusalem from the south. This outline right here is known as the City of David. It's about a 12-acre peninsula that juts down off the southern wall of the old city. These walls in Jerusalem were built in the 1500s. These are not the original walls. The original walls were knocked down by the Romans in 70 A.D. Okay? So these were rebuilt later. And as you know, the old city goes out like over here. I'll show you a graphic later. This City of David is what they're talking about when they say the decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. When Nehemiah came back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls, he's talking about rebuilding walls here. This is the Kidron Valley. This is an Arab neighborhood now. I think it's called Silva, something like that. And next week, or a couple weeks when we come back, we're going to go underneath the City of David because we were over there a couple of years ago with Eli Shukran, who is the archaeologist who discovered the Pool of Siloam, which is right down here, and he took us to places you can't go unless you're with him. This is the old city of Jerusalem. See, these are the current walls that go out here like this, you know, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is over here, and Gordon's Calvary's up here, the Mount of Olives is over here, and this is the city of David down here. Okay? Now, the decree, where's this decree? It comes from Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes, a Persian king. This is recorded in Nehemiah chapter 2, verses 1 to 8, where Nehemiah goes, he's the cupbearer for Artaxerxes, and he says, he's really depressed, and the king sees him and says, why are you so down? What's going on? He says, I want to go back and rebuild my city. Okay, I'll let you do that. And so, what do we know about Artaxerxes? Well, we know of his tomb. Here's his tomb right here. It's in Iran. You see that? That's a person. Right there. Can you see that? Here's a coin with Artaxerxes on it. He's got, I know it's an old coin, guys. This is like, this is 2,400 or so years old. And here's Artaxerxes, and he's got, look, an arrow and a bow here. Here is a picture, or actually a relief somewhere here on the tomb of Artaxerxes. And Artaxerxes wasn't buried alone. Check this out. This is a panorama of this area. Way over here you got Darius II. He's buried here. Here's our man Artaxerxes from Nehemiah chapter 2. Here's Darius I and Xerxes I. These are people. This is in Iran. Actually, I went to Iran about 10 years ago. It is a beautiful country, but things are a little bit more shaky than they were 10 years ago now. So I don't know if it would be good to go back. All right. Same verse here, verse 25, but after the decree, he says, until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. Of course, the city will be built again with a plaza and a moat, or the temple will be built again, even in times of distress. Now, the Messiah the Prince, who's this Messiah? Actually, it might say in your translation, anointed one, which means Messiah, the anointed one. Okay, so it's going to be 7 sevens and 62 sevens. So that's 69 sevens from the decree. When was the decree? 444 BC. If you do the math, you're going to wind up about 33 AD. You'll see why here in a minute. All right. Then it says, after the 62 sevens, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. After the 62 sevens. Not during the 70th seven, but after the 62 sevens. Now, what is this? The Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. First of all, if this says after the 62 sevens, first of all, you got 7 sevens, which is 49 years, and then 62 sevens, which is 434 years. When you add those up, you get what? 400, no, not yet. You get 483. You get 483 years. But if you go from 483 years from 444 BC, you wind up somewhere like 38 or 39 AD. And you go, well, that doesn't work. Well, the reason why it doesn't work is because the Jews used lunar years, 360 days rather than 365 days. 365 and a quarter. By the way, the quarter is why we're having this day today, right now, leap day, right? So if you multiply the days out, in other words, if you take 360 days times 483 years, and you add those days to 444 BC, you wind up 33 AD. Now, this obviously is written well in advance of 33 AD. In fact, even if the liberals are right, you know how we went through last time, how the liberals try and say that Daniel must have been written in 165 BC because he knows too much about what really happened. It must be history. It can't be prophecy, right? They have this anti-supernatural bias. So they say, it can't be prophecy. It's got to be history. Daniel's just looking back. He's not looking forward. Well, even if they're right about that, how did he know this? In 165 BC, he's saying that the Messiah is going to die in 33 AD. Coincidence, of course. Of course. He's going to have nothing. Why is he going to have nothing? The earthly kingdom didn't happen at that point. He got no glory in the sense that he didn't take over, at least not physically it didn't seem, right? The Romans were still there. He died as a pauper. His friends ran away. He had nothing. And the verse continues, and the people of the prince, or the ruler, your translation might say, who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood even to the end. There will be war. Desolations are determined. What is this referring to? Huh? Yeah, don't be so tentative back there. 70? Yeah, this is 70 AD. Who are the people of the prince? Who destroyed the city in 70 AD? The Romans. The Romans destroyed the city in 70 AD. This appears to be talking about 70 AD. So what do we have so far for the first three verses that are under dispute here? Daniel 9:24 to 26. It appears the overall message of these verses is the Messiah will come and make atonement before the second temple is destroyed. Right? Everyone see that? That largely, for the most part, is uncontroversial. Most Christians say, yep, that's what it means. So the first 69 weeks aren't all that controversial. It's the 70th week. That's the one where it gets real controversial. The 70th week is where people have controversy, or the 70th week is the controversial week. So let's see what the 70th week is about. That's the next verse, or the 70th seven. So the last seven. The 70th seven. And he, the ruler, thinking it'd be a Roman, right, will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 7, but in the middle of the 7, he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. Okay, what does that make you think of? Those of you who are just kind of in the background, eschatology's in the background in your mind, you're thinking, what's this covenant? And he's going to break the covenant halfway through. This sounds like, yeah, this thing says, this is what generally Antichrist, if you saw Left Behind or something, this is just a popular theology, the popular end times view, the dispensational end times view. There's going to be some kind of Antichrist, and he's going to come from Rome. Why? This guy's from the people that came to destroy the city in 70 AD. So they're Romans. Now, I've heard of one commentator say this. Most of the army that Titus brought weren't Romans. They were Turks, they were Syrians, they were mercenary armies that he picked up along the way. So he's saying it could be that if this is a reference to the Antichrist, that the Antichrist won't be Roman. He might be a Muslim. He might be a Turk. He might be a Syrian. But that's not a commonly held view. Let me just say that, okay? There's a lot of different views on this. It's not a commonly held view, but most people think it's going to be a Roman. Then finally, and on a wing of the temple he will set up an abomination that causes desolation. You've heard that before. Until the end that is decreed is poured out on him. Now, Christ referred to this incident, as you know, in Matthew chapter 20, I think it was 24. He says, you will see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation. And then John in Revelation talks about this in Revelation chapter 13. That the false prophet will set up an image to this ruler, and the world is going to be compelled to worship this image. And so many people think this is the 7-year tribulation. This is a reference to the 7-year tribulation. Now, you can't study eschatology without a chart. Right? Now, I took the liberty of running some of these off for you. Yeah, you guys were moaning there for a minute, weren't you? All right. Now, I got 30 here, so you might have to share, but let me just, let's just try and unpack this chart a little bit. This chart comes courtesy of my seminary professor, a guy by the name of Tom Howe, who teaches at Southern Evangelical Seminary here in Charlotte, North Carolina. And This is the dispensational view. What is the dispensational view? What you're looking at here, okay? It's not the only view. We don't have time to go through all the views here. It's not the only view. But I can say, or you can say with pretty much confidence, that there's not a lot of controversy. There's some, but not a lot of controversy about everything from here this way, right? The 69 sevens, pretty much people agree with. From 444 BC, you do the math, you come out to 33 AD, the Messiah, the prince, is cut off. He's killed, he has nothing. Here are the years. Now obviously this is not the scale, right? This is 7 years here, and this is 490 or 483. Okay, but you get the idea, all right? Now, this is thought to be the church age here. This last 7 hasn't happened yet. In other words, there's a gap between the 69th 7 and the 70th 7. Remember we said earlier, it says after that 69th 7, Messiah will be cut off, or after the 62 sevens, Messiah will be cut off. Okay, so after the 69 sevens, he's cut off. The dispensational view is that there's a rapture at some point where the church is taken out, and then at some point the tribulation starts, although there is no necessary connection between the rapture and the tribulation in Scripture. It could be that the rapture occurs, if there is going to be a rapture, and then the tribulation starts 1,000 years later. Could be. Most people don't think it's going to work that way. But the tribulation begins with the covenant for 1:7, which you just read, right? Okay, then there's the abomination that causes desolation halfway through. And then ultimately Jesus comes back. And then there's a millennium, out here. And then there's eternity, all right? Now, there is a gap here. The question is, how long is the gap?
We're in it.
Some will say we're in it. Others might say, well, much of this happened in the 1st century. And they come up with all different theories about maybe the 7 years occurring around 70 AD. Like some will say, well, this started in 67 AD, and halfway through, well, the city was destroyed, and then it went for another 3 years. But I don't see anything in history that says that there was a covenant made and then they broke the covenant, I mean, people come up with all sorts of different theories on where the last 7 is, the 70th 7. Regardless, it seems that there's an inevitable gap between the 69th and 70th 7. Either that inevitable gap is about 40 years, from 33 AD to about 70 AD, or it's still going on.
What do you think?
Well, I haven't seen, as far as from what I've read, I have not seen this happen yet. So this could be true. But there's still another view that says this could be true, and there's not a rapture. I'll get to that here in a minute. First of all, what's this deal with gaps? Have you ever heard of gaps or dual fulfillment? Gaps are common in Scripture, in prophecy. For example, Robert Gundry, a theologian, says the possibility of a gap between the 69th and 70th weeks is established by the well-accepted Old Testament phenomenon of prophetic perspective, in which gaps such as that between the first and second advents were not perceived. In fact, my friend Michael Brown, who teaches here in Charlotte, has a radio program, puts it this way: prophecy is often already but not yet. Already but not yet, meaning, yes, it's happened in a certain sense, but it hasn't happened completely yet. For example, the prophecy in Isaiah chapter 7 about a young woman will give birth, and what Matthew does is he takes that to be a virgin will give birth. Well, in Isaiah chapter 7, the short-term fulfillment was Isaiah's son, who was born in Isaiah chapter 8. The long-term fulfillment, the dual fulfillment, is it's referring to Jesus. In fact, maybe the best example of a gap is Jesus himself. Jesus goes into the temple in Luke chapter 4 in Nazareth, his hometown. And here's what happens. The scroll of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Unrolling it, he found the place where it is written this. And here's what he read. The Spirit of the Lord is on me because he has anointed me to preach the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind, to release the oppressed, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favor. Actually, there's not a period here, but I put it here. Why is there no period here?
Because it still goes on.
What's this a quotation from? This is Isaiah chapter 61. Before I tell you what's said after this, here's what happened next. Then he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of everyone in the synagogue were fastened on him, and he began by saying to them, "Today this scripture is fulfilled in your hearing." They're sitting in the audience going, "Isn't this the son of Joseph?" What? What's he talking about? That's talking about the Messiah. And then remember, they pinned him against the cliff. And then it just says he walked through the crowd. He just escaped. They thought he was committing blasphemy there. And he was, if he wasn't God, because he's claiming to do what the Messiah does. If he had continued to quote the verse in Isaiah 61, he would have been talking about the day of vengeance. Well, the day of vengeance is his second coming, not his first. So he ends it here and he says, this is fulfilled. But there's a gap. There's a gap between his first and second coming. And he just ends it there and says, it's fulfilled as of your hearing right here, right now. If he had continued, he'd have gone to his second coming. So again, a gap is not unprecedented. All right? Now you might say, well, Frank, what is another view? Well, another view is called historical premillennialism. This view is called dispensational premillennialism. What is dispensational premillennialism? That God has two dispensations. He has the Jews and he has the church. Historical premillennialism believes that there's one group of people, God's people, whether they're the church or Israel, they're all together. And historical premillennialism doesn't believe in a rapture. They believe that when Christ comes publicly, then his church will be caught up with him, but then come back to earth and reign. They're not going to be brought up, and then the tribulation happens, they're going to come and reign. So you want to say which view's better? I don't know. Okay? We're all going to find out in the end. I know in the end we win. Okay? You can make good arguments for all these different views. There's also amillennialism, there's postmillennialism, there's all these different views. Okay? Again, this is not very controversial. And this, to me, is the most important thing. Daniel just predicted the Messiah would be cut off in 33 AD. Don't lose sight of that. For all our arguments over the last 7, don't lose sight of the fact that no matter when he wrote that, he predicted that. That's prophecy. Now, you might say, well, I wish it was a little bit more clear. Well, I think that prophecy is pretty clear, right? The 70th 7 is where we have all of our controversy. Now, we put this up a couple of times ago when we were talking about eschatology or end times. And that is, let's review this briefly. What is the purpose of the Bible? Yeah, but why is it written? What's the point of it?
So that we might know God.
So that we can be more like that.
Be more like God. It's actually said in 2 Timothy 3 that the scriptures are there to make you wise about salvation. In other words, how do you get saved and sanctified? And the scriptures are useful for teaching, rebuking, correcting, and preparing us to do good works. Okay? So the ultimate purpose of the scriptures is to get you saved. Yeah, it's interesting to look at eschatology and end times and try and figure out what's going to happen, but that shouldn't be your focus. Your focus should be to know God, right? Your focus should be to know God, not what's going to happen in the future. Also, how would knowing every detail about the future affect your behavior adversely?
Changes everything.
It would, in fact, change your behavior going forward if you knew what was going to happen. In fact, Jesus says, look, no one knows the times or the seasons or the day or the hour. If Jesus doesn't know it, there's no guy on TV that knows it either, when Jesus is coming back. Also, how is your behavior affected when you know that despite inevitable trouble, ultimate victory is assured? Well, now you can be brave, right? Now you can get through anything because you know ultimately there's a light at the end of the tunnel. That's the purpose, one of the purposes of prophecy. It's not to tell you everything about everything. It's to assure you that despite the difficulty you're going through, that in the end, things are going to work out. And that's a lot of what Daniel is about, right? These people have been in exile for years. And it's story after story about God's faithfulness through all their difficulty. Now, one thing just struck me yesterday when I was flying back from Oklahoma yesterday. I was meditating here on this verse. Then after the 62 sevens, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. I want you to think about that. If this is really true, and it is, the creator of the universe, after creating us, decided that he was going to love us so much that he was going to come into the space-time continuum and add humanity over his deity, and allow the very human beings whom he created and sinned against him, he allowed them to torture him and kill him, and he got no glory out of it right then and there. He did that for us, which goes to show you the magnitude of God's love. Right? He didn't have to come this way, right? He could have come in another way. But he came in and allowed us to murder him, to torture him and murder him. John talks about this in the first chapter of John. It says, he was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. The world didn't recognize him when he came the first time. In fact, he came to that which was his own, the Jews, but his own did not receive him. What did he get? He was dead for 3 days. He didn't establish an earthly kingdom right there, right? He didn't get any glory. He didn't get pats on the back at that time, right? I mean, it was just, he had nothing. He was a pauper. Everybody ran away. He had nothing. Now, the Jews thought, well, when the Messiah comes, everything's going to be great. We're going to reign. Romans are going to be thrown off. He didn't bring any of that with him. That's when he comes again. But the point here is that his own did not receive him. He goes on to say, yet to all who received him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. Children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, nor of a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. In other words, Jesus came to his own rejected him, yet he gave the entire world the ability, the right to become his children by receiving him. So the gospel is really laid out in Daniel in the sense that he is the atonement for all of us. The Messiah will be cut off, and the atonement will be made. So back to the end times. Remember, if we had to sum up the end times, it would be this. A judgment is coming. Jesus will be the judge, and the saints will receive the kingdom. You want to haggle over premillennialism, postmillennialism, dispensational premillennialism, historic premillennialism, easy for me to say, amillennialism, be my guest. I think there's strengths and weaknesses of all the views. Okay? But the bottom line is here, this is what's going to happen. There is a judgment, and a judgment is coming. Now, I just got back from about a 9-day trip. I was in South Dakota first, and then Oklahoma. Our last night in South Dakota was at a church, and we were just finished the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist program, and there was a gentleman in the audience. We had microphones set up for questions. There's a gentleman in the audience that got up to the microphone and then broke down. He couldn't go any further. He couldn't even ask his question. So he had his question written down. It was on 2 pages. So he walked up toward the stage, and I just went down to him, and I took them from him, and he said, go ahead, read them. So I'm trying to read 2 pages in front of a whole bunch of people. And I realized what he was asking. And what he was asking was that he has 3 children, 2 sons, 1 daughter, and now they're all unbelievers suddenly. And the reason they're all unbelievers is because the daughter, from age 4 to age 14, was sexually molested by a friend of the family. And now she and her brothers have turned away from God. What do you say to that? And he was worried, are my kids going to go to hell because they rejected Jesus? And so I said, well, in this situation, there are 2 kinds of answers. There's a philosophical answer and a pastoral answer. You need the pastoral answer. So I said, can we talk after this is all over? And he said, yeah, sure. So when the thing was all over, I went to him and I said, hey, the pastor, me, and a couple other folks are going to dinner. You want to go? It's like 10 o'clock at night, right? So yeah. So we went to dinner. And he just unloaded for about an hour. And I said to him, I can understand why your kids are mad at God. In fact, you're probably mad at God. He said, yeah, of course. The Bible writers are often mad at God. But I want you to go back to your sons and say this, because his sons had came the night before and asked a whole bunch of questions. And the letter that he wrote, the note that he wrote said, my sons disagreed with everything you said. And I was going through the evidence for God and all this. So I said, what you might want to say to your son at the right time is, if you're going to say there is no God, then you must admit that what this guy did was not really wrong. Because if there is no God, there's no standard of rightness. Right? There's no standard of good. If there's no standard of good, then nothing can be evil, because evil is a lack in good. And also, and by the way, this guy who sexually molested her is still on the streets. Why? Because they know who he is. They scheduled trials, but every time they got close to trial, she would psychologically go downhill, because she was going to have to face him one-on-one in a courtroom, because according to the law, you have a right to see your accuser.
Today she's 14.
Today she's 18. This happened 3 years ago. It ended 3 years ago. And she actually wrote a book, Not Your Princess. It's about 100 pages. You can get it on Amazon. She has since gotten emails and calls from other young women in the same situation. I read an excerpt of this today, and I couldn't read anymore. Now, if there is no God and no judgment, this guy may never get justice. He may go to his grave after molesting a number of people. In fact, her father, Steve, who went to dinner with us, said he's already trying to groom another one. I know who it is. They are evangelical Catholics. And this guy was in the Catholic Church, never been married. He's not a priest or anything. He's just never been married. And Steve said this guy was like Jesus. He would always carry his Bible around. He had long hair, you know, and he was always praying, and it was all a big front. So if there is no God, this isn't wrong, and there will never be a judgment. But we know there is a God, and there will be a judgment. So I just wanted to tell you guys about that, because this problem is more prevalent than you might think. And this young woman was brave enough to write this little book that she self-published, and you can get on Amazon. So when Christ comes again, well, let me just say, when he did come, he atoned for sin, and he ended transgression. It's already, but not yet. This is still going on. It's already paid for, but it hasn't come to complete fruition yet. It will when he comes again, and be ready, because nobody knows when he's going to come back. It could be tonight, it could be tomorrow, it could be 10,000 years from now. We don't know.
Welcome to the 1 Minute Apologist. We interview the world's leading apologists to provide credible answers to curious questions.
Why should Christians be involved in politics? I mean, aren't we supposed to just be about proclaiming the gospel, Frank?
Well, we are supposed to be about proclaiming the gospel, but in order to proclaim the gospel, you have to have political freedom. And in fact, when people ask me that question or make that objection, I normally show them this picture. Now you can see this picture is a picture of the Korean Peninsula. Basically a homogeneous society made of Koreans. The South Korean section has light. It has electricity, as you can see. It has the gospel. It's one of the most Christianized countries in the world. North Korea, on the other hand, is a concentration camp. There's one major reason for the difference between South and North Korea, and the answer is politics. The South has political freedom, the North does not. And when you think about this, politics affects virtually everything we do. In fact, politics affects our home, our school, our children, our churches, our money, our health care, the poor, the unborn. Politics even affects this particular internet that we're using right now to bring you the 1 Minute Apologist. Because the laws that we make in Washington, the laws that we make in our state and local governments are laws that affect us all every day. And politics affects our ability to preach the gospel, Bobby. If you don't think so, or our viewers don't think so, go to some of the countries I've been to. Iran, Saudi Arabia, China. You can't do what we're doing in this room right now in those countries. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. They can't even see these videos in those countries. Why? Because politically they've ruled it out. So if you think preaching the gospel is important, and I do, then you have to think politics are important, because politics affects our ability to preach the gospel.
The preceding program was brought to you by CrossExamine.org and NRB TV.
Chances are, someone you love will one day be affected by some kind of vision problem. Save your vision for the years ahead. Call 1-800-437-2423 or log on to seeabettertomorrow.org to learn about glaucoma and macular degeneration.
Mom was diagnosed with Alzheimer's at 58 years old.
This disease just ravages a family.
It changes your life.